Machiavelli says, conquer power at any cost. The Stoics say renounce external power, and both are right and wrong at the same time, because whoever only plays the Machiavellian game becomes hostage to circumstances, and whoever only practices Stoicism becomes a doormat for those who manipulate the board. In 40 minutes, you'll learn situations where each collapses alone and how to use both together to never be caught off guard. The Stoic who ignores Machiavelli becomes easy prey. The Machiavellian who ignores Stoicism implodes at the first crisis he cannot control. I'll show you the fatal traps on each side and the synthesis no one teaches you. The truth is that true power requires mastering both internal and external control, because each philosophy alone creates a fatal vulnerability that the other exposes without mercy. This isn't an abstract philosophical question. It's practical survival in the real world where you live now. The terrain of this debate is simple. There are situations where you can change the world around you. Negotiations, conflicts, power relations. In these moments, controlling only your internal reactions isn't enough. You need to influence the board. But there are other situations where the world doesn't bend. Losses, crises, unexpected betrayals. In these moments, trying to manipulate the external is a waste of energy that destroys you from within. Most people choose a side and turn that choice into religion. They discover Machiavelli and apply manipulation to everything. Or they discover Stoicism and passively accept situations that could be changed. Both pay a brutal price for this rigidity. The cost of ignoring this truth is clear. If you only master the external game, the first crisis you cannot control annihilates you emotionally. You implode because you never developed inner strength. If you only master internal control, manipulators identify your passivity and use it against you. You become a philosophical doormat, while rationalizing your own defeat as wisdom. What's at stake here is your ability to act with precision, to know in real time which tool the situation demands, to execute without hesitation and without philosophical guilt. Whoever masters this flexibility is never vulnerable. Whoever clings to a single philosophy always has a fatal blind spot. You'll gain this in this video, the ability to recognize which context requires which response. And more importantly, you'll learn to execute both without betraying your integrity, because synthesis isn't hypocrisy, it's strategic mastery. But before building the synthesis, you need to see where each philosophy fails alone. And the first collapse I'll show you is the most brutal of all. The most expensive mistake you can make isn't choosing the wrong philosophy, it's turning any philosophy into an automatic response to everything. Because what should be a tool becomes a prison that prevents you from seeing half of reality. The pattern works like this. Someone discovers Machiavelli and becomes fascinated by the idea of controlling people and situations. Suddenly, everything becomes a power game. Every conversation is strategy, every relationship is a board. This person starts applying manipulation in contexts where it makes no sense, tries to control a child's reaction with political tactics, tries to negotiate with a disease as if it were an opponent who can be beaten with cunning. And when circumstances don't bend, they collapse because they dedicated zero energy to developing internal tools. The other side does the opposite, but arrives at the same place. Someone discovers Stoicism and falls in love with the idea of being emotionally invulnerable. Suddenly, everything becomes acceptance. Every injustice is treated as a character test. Every abuse is an opportunity to practice serenity. This person stops fighting in situations that could be changed with strategic action, accepts a toxic boss because controlling one's own emotions is nobler, tolerates a destructive relationship because reacting would mean losing inner peace. And while practicing acceptance, manipulators systematically destroy their life. Both commit the same fundamental error. They treat context as irrelevant, apply the same response in completely different situations, and they pay the price. The consequence is predictable. The Machiavellian develops chronic anxiety because he tries to control things that can never be controlled, lives in a permanent state of war even when there are no enemies. The Stoic develops pathological passivity because he confuses resignation with wisdom, loses real opportunities for change while meditating on acceptance. What connects these two errors is simple. Both eliminate the need to think. A single rule for everything is cognitively easier than evaluating each situation and deciding which tool to use. The brain loves simplicity, so it turns a philosophy into dogma and applies it blindly. But this simplicity has a brutal cost. You become predictable. Manipulators identify your single rule and use it against you. Or you become vulnerable. Crises expose your inability to adapt. There's a specific psychological mechanism that explains why people fall into this trap, and knowing this mechanism changes everything, because when you understand what your own brain is doing, you can disarm the illusion before it destroys you. Mastering both the internal and external seems the obvious answer, but your brain is actively working against you at this very moment, resisting this flexibility for reasons that make evolutionary sense but destroy you strategically. The human brain evolved to conserve cognitive energy. Thinking burns glucose. Making complex decisions depletes mental resources. So the brain developed a powerful shortcut. It creates universal rules that eliminate the need to evaluate each situation individually. Once you have a rule, you can apply it automatically without thinking. This frees energy for other survival tasks. When someone discovers Machiavelli, the brain registers this as a survival rule. Controlling the external is the answer to everything. This rule offers something deeply seductive, the illusion of omnipotence. If you can manipulate people and circumstances, nothing is beyond your reach. Every threat can be neutralized. Every obstacle can be bypassed. The brain loves this feeling because it eliminates the anxiety of powerlessness. When someone discovers Stoicism, the brain registers another survival rule. Controlling the internal is the answer to everything. This rule offers something equally seductive, the illusion of invulnerability. If you can control your emotional reactions, nothing can hurt you. Every crisis can be endured. All suffering can be transcended. The brain loves this feeling because it eliminates the anxiety of vulnerability. Both rules function as cognitive drugs. They give you a simple answer to the complexity of the world. You stop feeling that discomfort of not knowing what to do, because now you always know, always manipulate, or always accept. This certainty is addictive. The problem is that universal rules collide with contextual reality. The world doesn't operate on a single frequency. There are moments where manipulating is survival and accepting is suicide. There are moments where accepting is wisdom and manipulating is waste. The single rule leaves you blind to half the situations you face. And here's the most dangerous trap. The more you use a rule, the more the brain reinforces the neural circuits associated with it. You literally become less capable of seeing alternatives. The Machiavellian starts seeing conspiracy where there's chance. The Stoics start seeing lessons where there's abuse. Both lost the ability to read context with precision, but now that you know the mechanism, you can disarm it. And the first step is to see where Machiavelli really works, because there are territories where he reigns absolute, and ignoring this is fatal naivety. Controlling perceptions and influencing circumstances isn't vanity or evil. There are situations where this ability determines whether you survive or are destroyed. And recognizing these situations is what separates the naive from the strategist. The first territory where Machiavelli reigns is when you face someone already playing dirty. Negotiations where the other party deliberately lies. Professional environments where colleagues sabotage to advance. Relationships where someone emotionally manipulates for advantage. In these contexts, being only stoic is abdicating the board. You control your internal reactions, while the other controls external results. He advances. You stagnate. He gains territory. You maintain serenity while losing everything that matters. Machiavelli understood this studying the Italian courts of the 15th century, where nobles smiled while poisoning rivals, where alliances were forged at dawn and broken at dusk. He saw that those who refused to play the political game weren't admired for their purity. They were devoured for their naivety. Virtue without power is irrelevant, because the virtuous die first when the wolves arrive. The second territory is protection against those who read you easily. If you always react the same way, always forgive, always accept, always seek harmony, you become a tool in the hands of those who identify patterns. They know exactly which buttons to press to get what they want. They know you'll rationalize your own exploitation as spiritual growth. In this scenario, varying your responses, Creating unpredictability, establishing clear consequences isn't cruelty, it's protection of necessary boundaries. The third territory is when you need to build influence in competitive environments. Leading teams, negotiating resources, positioning ideas in organizations. In these contexts, the perception others have of you determines how much power you have to execute your intentions. If you're seen as someone without political ambition, your ideas are ignored even when correct. If you're seen as someone who doesn't play the game, you're left out of decisions that shape the future. Controlling how you're perceived isn't falseness. It's institutional survival strategy. These three territories require Machiavellian skills, mapping hidden interests, creating strategic alliances, calibrating perceptions, establishing consequences for those who test your limits. Without these tools, you lose not because you're weak, but because you're unarmed on a real battlefield. But there's an invisible limit where these same tools become traps, and crossing this line without noticing is where the Machiavellian collapses brutally and irreversibly. Whoever masters the external game seems invincible, built an empire of influence, has strategic responses for every threat. But when the first uncontrollable crisis arrives, what happens reveals the hidden fragility of those who built all their power on a single pillar. Cesare Borgia was one of the most feared men of Renaissance Italy, son of Pope Alexander VI. He conquered entire territories through strategic betrayals, calculated alliances, and precise violence. Machiavelli studied him closely and used him as a model of the perfect prince, someone who understood that power doesn't come from goodness, but from effectiveness. Borgia controlled perceptions, manipulated rivals, executed enemies before they could react. He was the personification of Machiavellian power in action. But when his father died and a hostile pope assumed power, all of Borgia's skills became irrelevant. He couldn't manipulate death, couldn't negotiate with the disease that killed his protector, couldn't create alliances strong enough to replace papal power. Within months, the man who seemed to control Italy was imprisoned, exiled and dying in obscurity in Spain. Machiavelli observed this collapse with fascination and horror because it revealed the fatal limit of purely external power. The Machiavellian develops pathological dependence on control. Each time he successfully manipulates a situation, the brain reinforces the belief that everything can be controlled if you're smart enough. This belief works perfectly in political environments, negotiations, interpersonal conflicts, but collapses before three categories of situations everyone faces. First, inevitable losses, death of loved ones, serious illnesses, aging. You cannot negotiate with cancer, cannot manipulate mortality, cannot create strategic alliance against time. When these crises arrive, the Machiavellian tries to apply his usual tools and discovers they don't work. This generates devastating anxiety because he never developed internal resources to deal with the uncontrollable. Second, genuinely unexpected betrayals. Not those you predicted and neutralized, but those that come from someone you trusted completely. The Machiavellian built his life distrusting everyone except a few people. When one of these people betrays him, he has no emotional tools to process this. He only knows how to counterattack, but counterattacking doesn't heal the internal wound. Third, existential crises that have no external solution. The feeling of emptiness despite success, the perception that you won the game but lost the meaning, the loneliness of someone who manipulated so many people they no longer know what genuine connection is. These crises destroy from within, while the Machiavellian maintains the facade of control. The Stoic faces these same situations and remains whole because he has tools the Machiavellian never developed. But before exploring Stoic territory, you need to understand where it collapses in the same brutal way. Controlling only what's under your internal power isn't resignation. It's the only rational response when you face forces that cannot be manipulated or negotiated. And mastering this ability determines whether you cross crises with dignity or collapse trying to fight the inevitable. Marcus Aurelius governed Rome as emperor for nearly 20 years, while the empire faced constant wars, devastating plagues and political betrayals. He had absolute power over millions of people, could order executions, start wars, redistribute wealth, but still spent nights writing to himself about accepting what cannot be changed. He understood something few leaders comprehend. There's suffering that no external power eliminates. There's pain that no manipulation solves. When the Antonine Plague killed millions of Romans, including people close to Marcus Aurelius, he couldn't manipulate the disease, couldn't negotiate with death, couldn't use political influence to stop a pandemic. What he could do was control how he reacted internally to these losses, could choose between collapsing in despair or maintaining mental clarity to continue governing. He chose the second option through Stoic discipline, separating what happened externally from what happened internally. The first territory where Stoicism reigns is before genuinely uncontrollable losses: death, terminal illnesses, accidents that permanently change life. In these moments, trying to manipulate the situation is a waste of energy that increases suffering. You don't control the fact, but totally control how you interpret the fact and how you respond emotionally. This distinction preserves sanity when the world crumbles. The second territory is when you're temporarily trapped in toxic environments you cannot abandon immediately. Jobs you need to keep for financial necessity, problematic family relationships that cannot be cut, social situations that require your presence. In these contexts, spending energy trying to change people or circumstances that actively resist only increases frustration. Stoicism teaches maintaining internal balance while planning long-term changes. The third territory is the development of genuine resilience that doesn't depend on external circumstances, the ability to maintain serenity independent of others' approval, to remain integral when no one is watching, to find meaning even when external results don't appear. This inner strength is what allows crossing decades of life with dignity. Seneca spent years exiled on an arid island by order of Emperor Claudius. He couldn't negotiate his return, couldn't manipulate imperial power from that position. What he did was use exile as a laboratory of Stoic practice, transformed external deprivation into internal wealth through philosophical discipline. When he finally returned to Rome, he returned mentally stronger than when he left. But this same strength can transform into prison when applied in wrong contexts, and that's where the Stoic pays a price as brutal as the Machiavellian. The person who masters internal control seems wise until encountering a situation that could be changed, but requires aggressive external action. And what happens in that moment reveals how acceptance can transform into complicity disguised as virtue. Epictetus was one of the most radical Stoics who ever existed. He was born a slave in Rome and spent decades under the control of a cruel owner who permanently broke his leg. Epictetus couldn't change his condition through manipulation or political strategy, so he developed a philosophy of absolute internal control. He repeated that no one can hurt you if you control your interpretations, that true freedom comes from accepting what cannot be changed. This philosophy kept him mentally sane under conditions that would destroy most people. And it was exactly this survival through acceptance that shaped all his future teaching. After he gained freedom and opened his philosophy school, Epictetus taught what he had learned as a slave. Accept tyrants, accept injustices, accept exploitations, because reacting externally is losing inner peace. For him, this logic made perfect sense. It had worked when he genuinely had no power. But his free students heard these teachings, and some applied them in completely different situations, where they had resources and power to change, where they should have fought but chose to accept because they confused passivity with Stoic wisdom. The Stoic develops pathological aversion to external conflict. Each time he successfully practices acceptance, the brain reinforces the belief that not reacting is always the superior response. This belief works perfectly in genuinely uncontrollable situations, but collapses before three categories that require strategic action. First, injustices that can be corrected through direct confrontation, bosses who exploit because they know you won't react, colleagues who steal credit because you always keep the peace, relationships where the other person emotionally abuses because you always forgive. In these contexts, accepting isn't virtue, it's permission for the destructive pattern to continue. The Stoic rationalizes his own exploitation as a character test, while the exploiter laughs at his naivety. Second, opportunities that disappear if you don't act politically, promotions that go to those who play the corporate game, projects that are realized by those who build strategic alliances, ideas that gain traction when someone knows how to sell the narrative. The Stoic observes these opportunities pass while meditating on detachment from external results. But detachment shouldn't mean abdicating influencing the world when you can and should. Third, relationships that die from lack of strategic assertiveness, friendships that end because you never express needs, romances that wither because you accept emotional crumbs, professional connections that don't evolve because you don't know when to push for reciprocity. The Stoic confuses not needing anyone with not knowing how to build genuine bonds that require negotiation and clear boundaries. Marcus Aurelius had power to execute treacherous senators, but chose to forgive repeatedly. Some historians argue this Stoic kindness weakened his authority and created more conspiracies. Acceptance has limits, and when you cross that limit, you become a philosophical doormat observing your own defeat with absurd serenity. Now that you've seen both sides collapse in isolation, you need to understand the specific patterns of mutual destruction, because that's where the truth reveals itself brutally. There's a pattern that repeats throughout history whenever someone with a Stoic mentality faces someone with a Machiavellian mentality, and understanding this pattern protects you from being devoured while practicing virtues that should strengthen you. The pattern works in 3 predictable phases that anyone can observe in professional, family, or social environments. In the first phase, the Machiavellian identifies the Stoic through specific behavioral signals. The Stoic doesn't react to provocations, always seeks harmony, forgives offenses quickly, doesn't play politics, trusts that doing the work well is enough. These behaviors should be admired, but for those who think strategically, they're signals of an easy target. In the second phase, the Machiavellian tests limits through small exploitations, asks for favors without reciprocity, subtly steals credit, speaks badly behind backs while smiling to faces, breaks smaller agreements to see if there are consequences. The Stoic interprets these tests as opportunities to practice virtue. He helps without expecting return, doesn't care about credit because he knows his value, ignores gossip because he controls only his actions, forgives broken agreements because judging others is losing energy. Each of these responses confirms to the Machiavellian that he can escalate exploitation. In the third phase, exploitation becomes systematic and destructive. The Machiavellian uses the Stoic as a ladder, delegates dirty work while reaping results, manipulates third parties' perception to make the Stoic seem incompetent, creates situations where the Stoic always loses but cannot prove manipulation. And most brutally, the Stoic continues interpreting all this as a character test. He maintains composure, controls his emotions, accepts defeats as learning about detachment. This 3-phase pattern appears at all scales, from corporate environments to historical political disputes. Cato the Younger was a classic example in ancient Rome, a senator known for absolute Stoic integrity. He refused political alliances, didn't manipulate votes, didn't negotiate principles. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar built power through strategic alliances and calculated violation of republican norms. Cato observed with moral disdain, but didn't play the political game necessary to stop Caesar, believed being virtuous would be enough. Caesar conquered Rome, and Cato ended up committing suicide when he realized moral purity was irrelevant before strategic power. The lesson isn't that virtue is weak. It's that virtue without strategy is naivety. Kindness without limits is invitation for exploitation. Serenity without capacity to punish transgressors is disguised passivity. The Stoic needs the Machiavellian to protect his own dignity, but the inverse is also true in an equally devastating way. There's a pattern where the Machiavellian collapses completely while the Stoic remains whole, and seeing this pattern changes how you understand power. There's a type of crisis that completely annihilates those who built all their power on external control, while those who developed inner strength cross the same situation with intact dignity. And witnessing this contrast reveals which type of power truly matters when everything crumbles. Machiavelli spent his life advising princes on how to conquer and maintain power through strategy, manipulation, and calculated force. He occupied positions of influence in the Florentine Republic, negotiated treaties, organized armies, manipulated political factions. But when the Medici retook Florence in 1512, All of Machiavelli's political skills became useless overnight. He was arrested, tortured, exiled to his own farm, and most revealing, he entered deep psychological collapse. During exile, Machiavelli wrote desperate letters trying to manipulate his return to power, offered his services to the same Medici who tortured him, repeatedly debased himself begging for any minor position. He couldn't accept the loss of external influence because he had never developed identity separate from political power. When he lost the external game, he lost himself. He spent years in depression because he had no internal tools to process a defeat that couldn't be reversed through strategy. Marcus Aurelius faced external crises worse than Machiavelli's: endless wars on the frontiers, betrayals by trusted generals, death of children, plagues that killed thousands daily. But he crossed all this maintaining mental clarity because he had spent decades building inner strength through daily Stoic practice. He wrote to himself every night, remembering he controls only his reactions, not external events. When his son Commodus showed himself inadequate as successor, Marcus Aurelius felt paternal pain but didn't enter existential collapse. He separated fact from interpretation. The pattern that differentiates the two is crystal clear. When you build identity only on external success, any loss of that success destroys who you are. You don't just lose power, you lose the meaning of existing, and this generates despair that no strategy solves. When you build identity on internal integrity, external losses hurt but don't destroy you. You remain whole because your value doesn't depend on circumstances others control. The Machiavellian tries to control the crisis of loss like he would control a negotiation. He bargains with death, manipulates doctors, seeks experimental treatments, not because they work, but because he cannot accept limits. When death arrives, he implodes because he spent life avoiding developing the only tool that matters in that moment: dignified acceptance of the inevitable. The Stoic faces the same death and says, "This is beyond my control. My control is in how I live until the end, in maintaining dignity, in not letting fear destroy my last moments." Seneca was forced to commit suicide by order of Nero. He gathered friends, discussed philosophy until the last moment, and opened his veins with serenity, without trying to manipulate Nero, without despair, just acceptance of what couldn't be changed. But this brutal difference between the two doesn't solve your real problem, because you're neither purely Machiavellian nor purely Stoic. You need both at different moments, and knowing when to use each is the decision that determines everything. The question that separates those who master both philosophies from those who only know theory is brutally simple. But most people never consciously ask it before reacting, and this omission costs decades of energy wasted on wrong battles. The question is this: can I significantly change this with external action? Not if you dream big or have infinite faith, but realistically. With the resources and time you have now, does this situation respond to strategy, negotiation, influence, or force? If the honest answer is yes, you're in Machiavellian territory. Passively accepting is abdicating power you have. If the honest answer is no, you're in Stoic territory. Trying to manipulate is waste that increases suffering. The problem is the brain doesn't make this evaluation naturally. It reacts based on immediate emotion or on automatic rules you installed. Someone offends you and you react defensively without asking if this person matters enough to spend energy. Someone rejects you and you try to change their mind without asking if this is under your control. You face a crisis and try to solve it externally without evaluating if the crisis requires internal acceptance. Marcus Aurelius made this evaluation consciously every day. He woke up and mentally listed what was under his control and what wasn't. Senator's actions weren't under his control, but his own decisions were. General's loyalty wasn't under his control, but how he led was. The masses' opinion wasn't under his control, but his integrity was. This distinction allowed him to act strategically where he could, and accept serenely where he couldn't. Machiavelli never made this distinction because he believed everything could be manipulated if you were smart enough. He saw the world as an infinite board, where there's always a move. This belief worked while he had political power, collapsed when he faced situations genuinely beyond his reach, like the Medici's return or his own irrelevance in exile. The practical application of this question is direct. Before reacting to any difficult situation, pause for 5 seconds and ask, Can I significantly change this with external action? If yes, identify which specific action. Negotiate, confront, create alliance, establish consequence, control perception. If no, identify which specific acceptance, separate fact from interpretation, focus on what you control, preserve energy for real battles. There are objective signs that reveal which territory you're in. Situations involving other people who have incentives aligned with change are Machiavellian territory. Situations involving natural forces, death, time, or people without incentive to change are Stoic territory. Situations where you have resources to influence outcomes are Machiavellian. Situations where spending resources doesn't alter probabilities are Stoic. But knowing the criterion isn't enough. You need the execution protocol for each territory, because knowing which tool to use is useless if you don't know how to use it with precision. When you identify that a situation can be changed through external action, there's a specific protocol that separates strategic manipulation from uncontrolled emotional violence, and mastering this protocol protects you from becoming the type of person you despise while seeking legitimate results. The trigger for Machiavellian action is an injustice or threat you can neutralize through strategy, and that, if ignored, will escalate and destroy you. Someone at work is systematically stealing your credit, and this affects your progression. A colleague is creating alliances to sabotage you, and you have clear evidence. A partner is violating agreements and harming the business you built. These contexts require external response, because passively accepting is inviting more exploitation. The execution has 3 layers that Cesare Borgia applied with surgical precision when conquering territories in Italy. First, map the real interests of everyone involved, not what they say, but what they really want. Power, money, status, security. Second, identify who can be an ally, who needs to be neutralized and who is irrelevant to the outcome. Don't waste energy on irrelevance. Third, build a narrative that makes your actions seem inevitable or just, not because you need moral approval, but because controlling perceptions reduces resistance. Cesare Borgia never attacked enemies directly when he could isolate them first. He created alliances with the target's neighbors, offered protection to those who submitted voluntarily, spread rumors about the enemy's tyranny to justify future invasion. When he finally attacked, the enemy was alone, without allies, with destroyed reputation, and the conquest seemed like liberation instead of aggression. This is Machiavellian strategy, executed with mastery. But there's a limit you should never cross when the psychological cost of strategy exceeds the material gain of the result. If you're losing sleep obsessed with revenge, if you're lying in ways that corrode your own integrity, if you're betraying people who trusted you without real strategic necessity, you've crossed from Machiavellianism to pathology. The sign you're executing correctly is that you solve the external problem without collapsing internally. The sign of correctness is direct. The problem is neutralized in 30 days, and you sleep peacefully because you know you acted within your own ethical limits. The sign of error is that you won externally, but developed paranoia, lost genuine connections, or feel you betrayed who you really are. Machiavelli described these tactics with coldness, but even he warned that gratuitous cruelty destroys the tyrant. Violence must be quick and necessary, never prolonged and sadistic. If you're extracting pleasure from the other's destruction instead of just neutralizing a threat, you're sick, not strategic. But as important as knowing when and how to act externally is knowing when this action is useless and you need the opposite protocol. Because there are moments where trying to change the external destroys you inside. When you identify that a situation cannot be changed through external action, there's a specific discipline that separates dignified acceptance from pathological resignation, and mastering this discipline determines whether you cross the inevitable with integrity or collapse, trying to control the uncontrollable. The trigger for Stoic control is a crisis genuinely beyond your reach, and that, if you spend energy trying to manipulate, will only increase your suffering without altering the outcome. Serious medical diagnosis you didn't cause and cannot reverse with money or connections. Death of someone close where there's no possible bargain. Betrayal by someone who already made final decision and won't reconsider. Loss of opportunity that already passed and won't return, even if you lament perfectly. Stoic execution has 3 layers that Marcus Aurelius practiced every morning before facing the chaos of governing Rome. First, separate the fact from your interpretation about the fact. The person died is fact. The person died to punish me is interpretation you created. Second, identify what's still under your control in this situation. Don't control the disease, but control how you treat your body during treatment. Don't control betrayal, but control whether you'll let this transform you into someone bitter. Third, redirect the energy you'd spend changing the external to strengthen the internal. Use the crisis as a laboratory for developing resilience. When the Antonine Plague devastated Rome, killing thousands per day, including people close to the emperor, Marcus Aurelius couldn't cure the disease, couldn't bring the dead back, couldn't stop contagion with imperial decrees. What he did was write to himself every night, remembering he controls only how he responds, that death is natural and inevitable for everyone, that his duty was to continue governing with clarity, even amid chaos. This practice kept him functional when other leaders entered paralyzing collapse. The limit of this practice is critical. You should never use Stoicism to accept situations that can and should be changed through strategic action. If you're in an abusive relationship and have resources to leave, accepting isn't Stoicism, it's cowardice disguised as philosophy. If you're being exploited at work and can negotiate or change jobs, tolerating isn't virtue, it's passivity that invites more exploitation. The sign of correctness is that you maintain serenity without developing passivity. You accept what you don't control, but act decisively on what you control. The sign of error is that you're accepting everything indiscriminately, including situations where you should be fighting, and rationalizing your own powerlessness as Stoic wisdom. Epictetus said, "Freedom comes from desiring only what's under your control." But he lived as a slave where this philosophy was necessary survival. If you have power to change unjust situations and choose to do nothing, you're not wise, you're complicit. Now, you have both protocols. But before applying them, you need to understand the objections and risks that destroy those who try to integrate the two philosophies without adequate protections. The resistance you feel now in integrating these two philosophies isn't accidental. There are specific objections that arise in the mind of those trying to apply this, and neutralizing these objections before they paralyze you determines whether you execute or just agree theoretically. The first objection is brutal and honest. Isn't this hypocrisy? Being Machiavellian in some moments and Stoic in others seems like moral contradiction, seems like you don't have fixed principles, that you're just justifying whatever behavior is convenient. The answer is direct. Contextual flexibility isn't moral incoherence. Machiavelli applied strategy in war and politics. Marcus Aurelius applied Stoicism in personal crises and inevitabilities. Neither was being hypocritical. They were being intelligent about which tool each situation required. Hypocrisy is preaching one thing and doing another. Contextuality is recognizing that different situations require different responses. The second objection is practical. How do I know when I'm misjudging the context? How do I know if I should be acting externally when I'm accepting or accepting when I should be acting? The criterion is observable result in 30 days. If you're applying Machiavellian strategy and in a month nothing changed, you're trying to control the uncontrollable, switch to Stoic acceptance. If you're applying Stoic acceptance and in a month the situation worsened because you didn't act, you're being passive where you should be strategic. Switch to external action. 30 days is enough time to see if your approach is working or if you're using the wrong tool. The third objection is psychological. What if I get stuck in the middle ground? What if I can't be fully Machiavellian nor fully Stoic because I'm divided between the two? This happens when you try to apply both simultaneously in the same situation. The solution is binary decision. Ask the question from the previous chapter. Can I significantly change this with external action? If yes, be 100% Machiavellian in that specific situation until resolved. If no, be 100% Stoic in that specific situation until crossed. Paralysis comes from trying middle ground, not from clearly choosing which tool to use. Marcus Aurelius faced this tension daily. In battles on the Germanic frontiers, he was a military strategist calculating every move. In his nightly diary, he was a Stoic philosopher, accepting mortality and impermanence. He didn't mix the two in the same moment. He alternated with clarity between contexts. When commanding troops, he used all available power tools. When reflecting alone, he practiced detachment from external results. This conscious separation allowed him to be excellent at both without internal contradiction. Seneca was Nero's advisor and used political manipulation to try to moderate the emperor's tyrannical tendencies. But when Nero ordered his suicide, Seneca didn't try to manipulate his way out. He accepted death with stoic dignity. Two contexts, two responses, zero hypocrisy. But knowing the objections isn't sufficient. You need to understand the specific execution risks that destroy those who try to apply this without adequate protections. Integrating two opposing philosophies creates specific risks that don't exist when you follow only one, and ignoring these risks transforms strategic mastery into self-destruction disguised as wisdom. The first operational risk is alternating too quickly between modes without giving time for each approach to work. You identify a situation as Machiavellian, act strategically for 3 days, don't see immediate result and switch to Stoic acceptance, then regret and return to external manipulation. This oscillation prevents any approach from working because none had time to mature. The protection against this is minimum commitment. When you choose an approach, maintain it for at least 48 hours before re-evaluating. This forces you to give the tool enough time to produce results before changing. The second operational risk is not recognizing when a situation changes category. You start applying Machiavellian strategy in a negotiation that really can be influenced. But midway through the process, the other party makes a final and irrevocable decision. In that moment, the situation changed from Machiavellian to Stoic. But if you don't notice the change, you continue spending energy trying to reverse something that's already over. The protection is mandatory weekly re-evaluation. Every week you ask again, can this situation still be significantly changed with external action? If the answer changed, your approach needs to change. The first ethical risk is using Machiavellianism as excuse for unnecessary cruelty. You're in real conflict and use this as justification to humiliate, destroy reputations gratuitously, violate your own integrity. Strategy doesn't require sadism. Machiavelli defended quick and necessary violence, not prolonged and gratuitous. The protection is the integrity limit. Never violate your own fundamental values, even when external strategy would work. If you need to become something you despise to win, you've already lost what matters. The second ethical risk is using Stoicism as excuse for moral cowardice. You see clear injustice you could combat, but choose to accept because confrontation is uncomfortable. Then rationalize your passivity as Stoic wisdom. Acceptance of tyranny isn't virtue, it's complicity. The protection is the agency question. Can I really not change this? Or do I just not want to face the discomfort of trying? If the honest answer is that you have power but are avoiding conflict, you're not being stoic, you're being cowardly. Cesare Borgia crossed the ethical limit when he started killing allies out of paranoia instead of strategic necessity. This didn't increase his power, it eroded the trust base that sustained his alliances. Cato crossed the opposite ethical limit when he refused to make political alliances that could have saved the Republic. His moral purity allowed Caesar to destroy the institutions Cato claimed to defend. Both errors destroy. But now that you know the risks and protections, you need to understand the ambiguous situations where neither protocol works perfectly alone. There are situations that challenge the clean division between what can and cannot be changed, and how you navigate this gray zone determines whether you master both philosophies or paralyze when reality doesn't fit perfectly into protocols. The first category of ambiguity is when you can change something, but the cost is disproportionate to the gain. You're in a relationship that technically can be fixed through strategic communication and therapy, but this would require 5 years of intense effort for uncertain result. Here, both Machiavellian action and Stoic acceptance are valid depending on other factors in your life. There's no universally correct answer. What separates mastery from paralysis is you making conscious decision instead of oscillating. You honestly evaluate whether you have energy and motivation to invest the necessary cost. If yes, commit 100% with strategy. If no, accept 100% and redirect energy. The second category is when results depend partially on you and partially on uncontrollable external factors. You're seeking promotion at work. You control your performance and networking, but don't control superiors' final decisions or presence of external competitors. Here the real synthesis emerges. You act strategically on what you control, build alliances, demonstrate value, position your achievements while simultaneously accepting stoically that final result doesn't depend only on you. Machiavelli would say, maximize your chances through strategy. Marcus Aurelius would say, do your best and accept the result without collapsing if it doesn't come. Both are right simultaneously. Seneca faced exactly this as Nero's advisor. He could influence some of the emperor's decisions through careful argumentation and manipulation of rival advisors, but couldn't control Nero's fundamental tyrannical impulses. Seneca applied strategy, where he had margin of influence, tried to moderate the worst atrocities, built alliances with reasonable senators, but simultaneously practiced stoic detachment because he knew Nero could kill him at any moment, independent of his actions. This duality kept Seneca functional for years in an impossible situation. When Nero finally ordered his death, Seneca had already internally prepared for this outcome through daily stoic practice. The third category is when you don't know if you can change something because you never tried. You assume a certain situation is beyond your control, but actually never tested the real limits. Here the protocol is low-cost experimentation. You try to influence the situation for 2 weeks with moderate effort. If nothing changes, you have real evidence you're in stoic territory. If something changes, you discovered you had more power than you assumed. Paralysis comes from assuming without testing. Machiavelli spent years in exile, assuming he'd never have political influence again. But when he finally offered his services to the Medici by dedicating the prince to them, he discovered he still had some margin of return, even if smaller. He never recovered previous power, but recovered some relevance if he had completely accepted without ever trying. He would have died in total obscurity. The gray zone isn't the exception. It's where you spend most of real life, and mastering these ambiguities prepares you for the final identity transformation. Whoever masters both internal and external control is no longer Stoic nor Machiavellian, is something that transcends both categories, and understanding this new identity determines whether you apply this as occasional technique or as permanent transformation. The contrast is clear. Before you were hostage to a single philosophy that determined your responses independent of context. You were the Stoic who accepted everything, or the Machiavellian who manipulated everything. After this transformation, you're the contextual strategist who evaluates each situation individually and consciously chooses which tool to use. You have no philosophical loyalty. You have loyalty to effectiveness and integrity simultaneously. The transition milestone happens the next time you face a real crisis, and your first reaction isn't automatic but conscious. You stop for 5 seconds and ask, can I significantly change this with external action? If yes, you act with Machiavellian precision without moral guilt. If no, you accept with stoic dignity without pathological resignation. This 5-second pause is the moment where you stop being reactive and become strategic. The automatic patterns of this new identity are 3. First, you evaluate context before reacting emotionally. Second, you don't judge the tool but judge the result it produces. Third, you review your decisions weekly to ensure you're not applying the wrong tool by inertia. These 3 behaviors become automatic through conscious repetition over the next 90 days. What becomes incompatible with this identity is philosophical dogmatism of any type. You can no longer say I am Stoic or I am Machiavellian as if it were permanent essence. You're someone who uses both when appropriate. Philosophical purity ceases being virtue. Strategic flexibility becomes the standard. The consolidation ritual is simple and powerful before any important decision over the next 30 days, say out loud or mentally. Can I significantly change this with external action? This ritualized question forces conscious evaluation and prevents automatic reactions. Do this 30 times, and the pattern installs permanently. You came this far because you don't want to be hostage to simple formulas. You want to master the real complexity of power. Now you have the complete map, the decision criterion, the execution protocols, the protections against risks. What separates those who apply from those who only know is starting now, in the next difficult situation, ask the question and execute the response without hesitation. If you want to understand how Machiavelli destroyed enemies with surgical precision, or how Marcus Aurelius maintained serenity while Rome burned, click on the video on screen now. You'll discover specific techniques that transform theory into applicable power, strategies that worked for centuries and still work today. Don't let this knowledge die here. Click on the video on screen and continue building the type of power no one can take from you.